And I'd like to invite any children who are present to come and join me. So since some of you guys were in the nursery when I read the story, I'm going to tell it really quickly again. Jesus was with his disciples, and he sends them out in a boat. And he goes off somewhere else to pray by himself. And the disciples are stuck out in the boat for a long time, and the wind is really pushing the boat away from the shore. And eventually, in the middle of the night, they see Jesus walking to them on the water. And they're scared. They think he's a ghost. And he says, "No, calm down. It's just me." And Peter, in response to that, says, "Well, if it's you, then tell me to come walk on the water." And so Jesus says, "Okay, come on out and walk on the water." And Peter does, and of course, recognizes that the wind is blowing and the waves are lapping, and he starts to sink in the water, and Jesus grabs him by the hand, tosses him back in the boat, and says, "What's wrong with you? Why are you doubting me?" You know where Peter messed up in that whole story? He got out of the boat. Can you walk on the water? Can you walk on the water? Of course not. What happens if you try to walk on the water? You sink. How old are you guys? 9? 5? Nora, are you 3 or 4? 3? Yeah, you know you can't walk on the water, right? You can swim in the water, right? You can sit in the water. I'll bet you even Miles has it figured out that if you try to walk on the water, you're going to sink. We all know that. Peter's doubt that Jesus talks about has nothing to do with the fact that he couldn't walk on the water. It has to do with the fact that when he saw Jesus coming to him, he didn't believe it was Jesus. And instead of welcoming Jesus in this, albeit odd way, he says, "Well, okay, if it's you, you get me to do something that's odd too." We tend to do that with God a lot in our lives. We try to say, "Oh, well, okay, you're coming into my life, but if you want me to do this first, I want you to do something for me. I want you to give me some special power," or something like that. Each one of you is already everything that God needs to do God's work in the world. You don't have to have special superpowers, be able to do things that other people can't do. You don't have to walk on water. All you have to do is be the beautiful, talented people that you already are. And trust that when God comes into your life, that you're ready now to welcome him in and to go where he needs you to go. Already, now at the age of 5, the age of 9, the age of 3, you're everything God needs you to be right now. And all you need to do is be ready to say yes when God asks. Let's go get some stamps. Hey, William. Why not? There you go. In our reading today from the letter to the Romans, Paul says, "For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek." It's kind of a pared down version of what he says elsewhere in some of his other letters. At its fullest, in Corinthians, I believe, he says, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, neither male nor female, but all are one in Christ Jesus." If you watch the news, particularly the news from this weekend, you know how very, very far our society is falling short of that vision that Paul proclaims. I hadn't planned to talk about all of this until this weekend happened, and the Holy Spirit won't let me escape from it, so here we are. It started on Friday evening as I watched news reports of white supremacists in Charlottesville, Virginia, carrying torches, marching across the UVA campus, shouting Nazi slogans, surrounding St. Paul's Memorial Episcopal Church, where many of my friends were gathered with other clergy and other believers to pray for peace and unity. On Saturday morning, more white supremacists gathered, some of them armed to the teeth, ready to march through Charlottesville again. Eventually, things got enough out of control that the police disbanded the big march. People started moving off down side streets, including the counter-protesters. And eventually, it got bad enough that one young man from Ohio who had driven there to join the white supremacists in their march drove his car through a crowd of protesters, killing a 32-year-old woman and injuring 19 other people. Like I said, I had not planned to speak today about racism. The sermon I had wanted to preach got thrown out the window over the last 36 hours. And so I'm going to confess that I'm still just wrestling with everything that's been happening this weekend. And I don't have all the answers to it. But I do want to share with you a couple of stories, some stories that will tell you maybe a little bit about where I'm at, places I'm going to find some solace and some inspiration. One of these stories is from 1962. Back in 1962, a young man named James Meredith enrolled in the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss. And much as we saw in Charlottesville this weekend, mobs of white supremacists came to Oxford, Mississippi, and were rioting. At one point, somebody climbed up on the Confederate monument in the middle of campus and raised the Confederate battle flag. An Episcopal priest, the rector of St. Peter's in Oxford, a man named Duncan Gray, walked into the middle of that mob, climbed up on the monument, tore down the battle flag, and appealed to those who were rioting around him to disperse. Now, this story ends about the way you would expect it to end. The mob didn't listen. In fact, they pulled Duncan down off of that monument, intent on beating him to death. Somebody in the crowd grabbed hold of him and got him out of there. And it would take armed soldiers from the National Guard to get James Meredith through the crowd and into his classes. Duncan went on to become the Bishop of Mississippi in later years. Eventually a interim dean a couple times in Sewanee, where I got to know him, where he taught me the blessing that I often use at the end of the service, which I'll use today. But what I've been focusing on from Duncan's life is what he had to say to his congregation from the pulpit the Sunday after those riots happened in Oxford. He said to his very white congregation, "You and I, along with every other Mississippian, are responsible for what happened at Ole Miss, because we are responsible for the moral and political climate in our state which made such a tragedy possible." I want to expand that a little bit today and say that all of us, you and I, along with every other American, are responsible for what happened in Charlottesville this weekend. Because we are responsible for the moral and political climate in our country that allowed for this to happen. Now, I'm not interested in casting blame, so if you're expecting me to now jump into the political fray and try to say that one person or one group of people is more responsible, you can just skip past that, because that's not happening. I'm tired of blame. I'm tired of excuses. I really want to focus on what Duncan said that day, that we, all of us, are responsible for the fact that our country is so far away from that vision that St. Paul proclaims, that vision where there is no Jew or Greek, no racial divide, no gender divide, no status divide. We are, all of us, responsible. And as long as we are not living in a land where that vision of unity is a reality, then we've got work to do. Another story. This one from 1965. There was a young Episcopal seminarian, about 26 years old, named Jonathan Daniels. Came from a well-off family in New Hampshire, had gone to the best boarding schools, valedictorian of his class at the Virginia Military Institute. And he was sitting in chapel at seminary one day, listening to the Magnificat being sung, that great hymn of Mary, proclaiming how God is lifting up the lowly. And something clicked in his heart. Not long after that, he heard the call that Martin Luther King had issued for clergy from throughout the United States to come down to Selma in the wake of Bloody Sunday, for clergy to come and walk together across a bridge. And he took a leave of absence from seminary, and he went to Selma. After the clergy had their walk with Dr. King, most of them went home. Jonathan didn't. He stayed down in Selma, only going home very briefly in May of 1965 to take his exams, and then to extend his leave of absence and return south. And in Dallas and Lowndes counties in Alabama, Jonathan worked on voter registration projects, on educational projects, and in demonstrating for equality. August 14th of 1965, Jonathan and 29 other people were protesting outside of a segregated store in Fort Deposit, Alabama, and they were arrested and hauled off to the county jail in Hayneville. There they were put into 3 cells, 7 or 8 to a cell. No running water, no functioning toilets, no showers, no air conditioning, and no food except for once a day when the jailers would toss them some stale bread and old bologna. And they stayed in those cells for a week. And suddenly on August 20th of 1965, they were released without warning. Somebody went to the payphone, made a call to get somebody from Selma to come pick them all up, 45 miles away. And while they waited, Jonathan Daniels and a Catholic priest named Richard Morrisroe and 2 teenage African-American women, Ruby Sales and Joyce Bailey, decided they'd walk a block from the jail to a little Barner's cash store and buy some cold Coca-Colas. When they got to the door, a part-time deputy sheriff named Tom Coleman came busting out the door of the store with a shotgun, and he aimed it at Ruby Sales. And John Daniels shoved her out of the way and put himself between Tom Coleman and her and took the blast of the shotgun in his stomach, dying instantly. Richard Morrisroe tried to grab the girls and run away, and Tom Coleman shot him in the back. And they left him to lie for dead for 2 or 3 hours under the Alabama sun in the middle of the street until somebody finally brought an ambulance from Selma or Montgomery or someplace like that to pick him up. Yesterday, 11 of us from here at St. Matthew's went down to Hayneville, joining with other folks from around the Diocese of Alabama and the Diocese of the Central Gulf Coast down on the Alabama coast. And we walked to that jail where they were held. We went to the spot where Jonathan died and prayed there. We gathered then in the courthouse, in the courtroom, to celebrate Eucharist. That courtroom, by the way, was where John Daniels' killer was led off. Tom Coleman was promptly charged after Daniels' death, and then the judge and the sheriff of Lowndes County conspired to rush a trial while Richard Morrisroe was still in hospital and couldn't testify, and an all-white jury found Tom Coleman innocent by reason of self-defense. Not that far off from some other things we hear in the news today. We gathered in that courtroom and celebrated the Eucharist there. And during that time, we heard from Bernard Lafayette, a Baptist minister, theologian, one of the founders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Council, someone who was a friend of Jonathan Daniels and who worked with him. We heard from Dick Morrisroe. Dick's not a priest anymore. He eventually, after healing from his wounds, left the priesthood, got married, became an attorney, spent the rest of his life working for civil rights, is still today an advocate for those who are oppressed and downtrodden. We heard from the judge who now sits in that courtroom where Jonathan Daniels' killer was let off the hook. All of them had a similar message for us. A message of how we are, all of us, called to be exemplars of the love that we hear of in Paul's letter today. That love that makes us one to the point where our divisions no longer matter. And they spoke to us of the need to dedicate ourselves to the work begun more than 50 years ago, to try to make that love a reality here in our country. At the end of the reading we had from Romans today, Paul says, "How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news." The world doesn't learn about the love of Jesus if we're sitting here in church, or if we're sitting in the comfort of our homes. If we want the world to know this love, if we want the world to know this vision of unity, then we've got to be on our feet. We've got to carry that love out the doors of our church, out the doors of our homes, and be willing to proclaim it with our lives. We've got to be willing even to give our lives like John Daniels did, so that others might know that the message is true, and that the love of God is stronger than any message of hate proclaimed by torch-bearing neo-Nazis. "50 years ago, when John Daniels went down to Selma, the civil rights movement knew that the good news was proclaimed by marching and walking. They got out of their doors and they went out into the streets and they demanded that the world around them be changed. It's time for us to do the same thing. To be wholly dissatisfied with a world in which racists feel empowered to march by the hundreds or thousands down the streets of an American city shouting hate. To be wholly dissatisfied with a world in which some of us live in more danger than others. To be wholly dissatisfied with a world in which some of us are seen as less than fully human. The gospel will be satisfied with nothing less than the vision of unity that Paul proclaims. When our forebears used to take to the streets and march for justice, they also lifted up their voices. They sang out the vision that they were marching for. And while we hadn't planned for it today, the choir has indulged me and done a little quick practice in between the services. And so I want to invite you all to join us in song this morning, and to get onto your feet and to turn to hymn 599. And sing out the vision that the gospel proclaims.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of a new day begun, let us march on till victory. Of our bright